Hello, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started with our first asynchronous lecture. So hopefully this goes well, and if it does, we will continue to do this in the future. But let's go ahead and take a look at our lectures, which will include the muscles of the arm as well as the brachial plexus. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the muscles of the arm. And very luckily, there aren't too many of those, so I mean, it's not too bad. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at, or rather reminding ourselves of the anterior and posterior compartments formed by the brachial fascia. So basically, the arm is kind of divided between two sides, the anterior and then the posterior side. And in those two compartments, you will have muscles that mostly either do flexion or extension. So the anterior side is going to be where you have the flexors, the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and coracobrachialis. But then the posterior side is going to have mostly the triceps brachii, but also a small muscle called the anconeus. Now, if you recall, like those compartments are going to be formed by the brachial fascia, but specifically these two linings of the muscle, rather, called the intermuscular septa. So you have the lateral intermuscular septum as well as the medial intermuscular septum. And those two septa go from the humerus to the skin, and that allows them to kind of separate the flexors and the extensor sides. Now, there is a little bit of difference in like our abilities to use these muscles as well. And just to be clear, like when we talk about flexors, we're talking about muscles that mostly pull or flex or decrease the angle of a joint. And then when we push or straighten out, that is when we are using the extensors. So between the two, we actually can pull a lot more than we can extend, specifically almost 2 times as much. So we have much stronger pullers than we do pushers. Now to take a look at our first muscle that we have here, we have the biceps brachii, a very well-known muscle, a very glorified muscle. And this muscle, if we look closely at its name, tells us quite a lot. So first of all, biceps brachii. So bi, first of all, means two, seps means head, and then brachii means arm. So if you remember those like things, you kind of like get the gist of like how it's organized, where to find it. So in the term biceps, the two heads are actually separate. And specifically, you'll see that there are two different origins for this muscle, being that you have a long and short head attached to different things. So look closely at this two-headed muscle here. There are two different attachments. And if you're wondering which one is which, like a good way to remember this is long head, lateral. Long head, lateral, L and L. So I know that if you look at this lateral head right here, it does look kind of short, but just to be clear, it is going to be covered by the transverse ligament of the humerus, which is going across the intertubercular intertubercular groove, intertubercular groove. So if you follow this up, you can see that it goes up and around the humerus, and it's actually going to go like all the way above the shoulder to the supraglenoid tubercle. So I know you can't see it, but it's going to go all the way up across the joint to the supraglenoid tubercle. But what you can see is the short head of the biceps brachii, specifically attached to this anterior process of the scapula. So this is connected to the coracoid process of the scapula. So you can also see a small little tendon right here for the pectoralis minor. And you might even also see that there's another muscle right next to it, which will also connect to it as well. So two different origins for the biceps brachii, but one singular insertion, because if you look at it, if you look at the muscle, they both kind of fuse and combine down here to go to this thickened region of the brachial fascia, which is called the bicipital aponeurosis. And that is going to go down and connect mostly to the radial tuberosity. So that is actually one of the bones of the forearm. So it goes across the elbow to the forearm to connect to the radial tuberosity. Now, just to be clear though, like given that you have those two long heads, like they will actually do different actions, but a lot of them are actually going to be shared as well. So first of all, take a look at this muscle though. Like think about its actions and look at the joints that it goes across. So first, you can see that it goes across the shoulder joint, but it also goes across the elbow joint. So it can actually move both ways. It can move the arm and it can move the elbow. So if you look closely, both of them do shoulder flexion, as well as both of them do some type of elbow flexion. Now, if you look closely though, like they do kind of specify a little bit with the short head helping with shoulder adduction. So shoulder adduction is on the medial side, so it actually can pull the shoulder downward like this. That is going to be one action of the short head of the biceps brachii. But then the long head of the biceps brachii, oddly, if externally rotated, is going to be in a position to help with abducting the shoulder a little bit. So it doesn't do it a whole lot, but it can help with abducting the shoulder as well. Now, one action that it does do that you often will do and focus on, like in a bicep curl, is that it can help with twisting or supinating the forearm. So when you supinate the forearm, that's when you like have your palm either anteriorly or superiorly, and that's when you can also use the biceps brachii. So try this out if you can. Like start out here with like your hand somewhat vertical like this. Bend your elbow about 90 degrees. Feel your biceps brachii and then twist as hard as you can. Twist so that your palm is facing up. And that is supination. And you should feel or even see like a major like extra contraction in the biceps brachii. Now, lastly, for the biceps brachii, it does also have a specific nerve innervation, which is the musculocutaneous nerve with the roots C5 and C6. Now, luckily, for most of the flexors, though, it is actually going to be innervated generally by the same. So musculocutaneous nerve will go to generally all of these anterior muscles. But to get to that, let's go ahead and take a look at our next muscle called the brachialis. Now, the brachialis, what does brachial mean? What does brachii mean? Like this means arm. And in fact, it is just straight on the front of the arm. Like it is actually deep to the biceps brachii. So if you look closely, you have the biceps brachii here, but you have to remove that to see it clearly, at least the whole thing. So this down here is the brachialis, and take a look at its origin and insertion. So it is actually going to be connected to the middle of the humerus. Like it actually doesn't go all the way across. It doesn't go all the way up. It just goes to the middle of the humerus. It just goes smack dab in the middle. So that means that it doesn't go across the shoulder joint. So it only is going to go across the elbow joint when it inserts onto the coronoid process of the ulna. So you can see the ulna over here. It is going to connect to the coronoid process as well as the ulnar tuberosity. Now, being that it goes across the elbow joint, it is going to move the elbow joint, and this is in the anterior compartment, so this flexes the elbow. And once again, it is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve with roots C5 through C6, but then it also does have a slight innervation by the radial nerve as well. Now, our next muscle and last flexor that we have here is called the coracobrachialis. Now, coracobrachialis. I mean, we've been learning these, so hopefully coraco might sound a little bit familiar, but that is referring to the coracoid process. So coracoid process, brachialis, arm again. This is going from coracoid process down to the humerus. So the origin or the muscle that we're looking for is right here, actually, directly medial to the short head of the biceps brachii. And you can see it connecting up here to the coracoid process, and then it inserts down here into the middle of the shaft of the humerus. So it's actually going to connect kind of like on the medial side of the humerus, opposite to the deltoid tuberosity. Now, this one doesn't go across the elbow joint, but it does go across the shoulder joint. So similar to the short head of the biceps brachii, it can help with flexion of the shoulder as well as adduction of the shoulder. Because remember, it's on the medial side, so it can pull it down back towards the midline. And once again, it is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve, but then look at the roots. The roots are slightly different. It's C6 and C7. So just to kind of point out that musculocutaneous nerve, you can see it here. It actually goes kind of like along the coracoid process, on top of the biceps or under the biceps brachii and over the brachialis, or over the brachialis down here. Now moving to our posterior compartment, we have the triceps brachii. The triceps brachii is going to have 3 heads, being triceps, kind of like tricycle, and then once again brachii. What does that mean? Arm. So in this case, we have 3 different origins and 3 different heads. So instead of just having like long head and short hair, there's actually 2 heads on the sides and then 1 in the middle. There's lateral and medial head. So lateral head and medial head, like those are on the sides, and then long head is in the middle. So we actually looked at the long head of the biceps brachii and the lateral head of the biceps brachii, and those two, you can see, kind of like have a little V in the middle. That's where we were looking for those different structures, which were the posterior circumflex humeral artery, as well as the radial nerve. But if you look closely, like these 2 heads are specifically named, and the more lateral one is the long head of triceps brachii, or lateral head of triceps brachii, and then this one that goes further up, this is going to go across the shoulder joint, the long head of the triceps brachii. So given that it goes across the shoulder joint, it is going to go to the scapula, specifically the infraglenoid tubercle. So remember, you have the long head of the biceps brachii going to the supraglenoid tubercle. The long head of the triceps brachii goes to the infraglenoid tubercle. Now, those 2 other heads, the lateral head and the medial head, are actually going to be connecting to the humerus relative to the radial groove. So the lateral head connects to the humerus above the radial groove. The medial head connects to the humerus below the radial groove. So in fact, the medial head doesn't go very high. Like it doesn't go super high up. It just kind of like connects to the mid region of the humerus. Now, regarding its insertion being on the back of the back of the arm, it is actually going to connect down to the back of the elbow, and the region for that, as well as the landmark that is on it, is referring to olecranon, specifically the olecranon process of the ulna. So that is going to be connecting to like the back of the elbow, and that means that it goes across the elbow, allowing it for elbow extension. But keep in mind, the long head of the triceps brachii went across the shoulder joint as well, helping to allow for shoulder extension as well as shoulder adduction. Now, the triceps brachii is going to be innervated by a different nerve from the flexors, which is the radial nerve. And the radial nerve will include roots C6, C7, C8, and T1. Now, our last muscle, a small muscle on the back of the elbow region, this is called the anconeus. So the anconeus muscle you can see right down here. So pretty small. But this is going to be a small muscle that goes across the elbow joint, so it also helps with elbow extension. So you can see the anconeus attached to the side of the arm here at something called the lateral epicondyle, and then it's going to insert, like the triceps brachii, at the olecranon process. And then once again, being an extensor, it's the same nerve, radial nerve, but specifically the roots C7 and C8. Now, really quickly, while we're looking at these muscles, let's also talk about a few spaces that are formed by these muscles, which include the quadrangular space right over here, the triangular space over here, and then the triceps hiatus. Now, the quadrangular space, quad, meaning four, has four borders. That will include the superior border, which is the teres minor, the inferior border, which is the teres major down here, the lateral border, which is the humerus, and then the medial border, which is the long head of triceps brachii. So you actually can't see the teres minor, but this is where you'd find the quadrangular space. And this is where we had to kind of like remove the deltoid to be able to see. This is going to be where you find the axillary nerve, as well as the posterior circumflex humeral artery. And then just to be clear, the vena commutantes, like that's actually kind of like small nerves, or sorry, small veins that travel with it. Now the triangular space is going to be located right over here. You can see the superior border being the teres minor. You can see the inferior border being the teres major. But then once again, the lateral border will be the long head of triceps brachii. And this is where you can see a small artery coming across called the circumflex scapular artery. Now, lastly, you have the triceps hiatus, which is what we cut and expose to find like a couple of structures. But once again, you can see long head of triceps brachii being the medial border in this case, lateral head of triceps brachii being the lateral border in this case, and then superior border is teres major. So this is where you're going to find a blood vessel and nerve running down the back of the humerus underneath the triceps brachii, the radial nerve, which innervates the muscle, and then also the profunda brachii artery. Now, if you look at these pictures, you can see the connections a little bit more easily with biceps brachii with its two heads, short head and long head, right next to short head of biceps brachii, coracobrachialis. And then 3, connecting to the middle of the arm, going across the elbow, this is going to be the brachialis. And then the 3-headed triceps brachii with long head, lateral head, and then medial head, and then a small muscle called the anconeus. Now, I know that nerves have been confusing so far, and to be honest, they probably will continue to be confusing. But we will do our best to explain this a little bit more to make sure that we can at least start to understand this and how it's organized, because this is going to be very crucial for understanding a lot of like pathology with muscles or even sensation. Because if you know where the nerves came from, you might know what nerves are affecting this body part and what issues those body parts might have. So when we hear the word brachial plexus, what do we like actually refer to? We're referring to like the nerves of the arm. Basically, brachial means arm, and then plexus means a group of nerves. And you can see that you have a bunch of nerves coming out of here, but we will look at this section by section as well as branch by branch. So, I mean, hopefully it won't be quite as daunting as it is now. So there's a lot to go over. So let's go ahead and get started with some very like introductory stuff. So this is what we're going to be going over, but let's just go ahead and get started by taking a look at the spinal cord a little bit. So if you look closely, like you can see that this is actually the vertebral column, and then you have the spinal cord running right down the middle. So the vertebral column typically covers and surrounds the spinal cord so that it's protected. But then coming out from the spinal cord, you have these spinal nerves that are going to go all throughout the body. So if you look at these numbers, there's actually certain numbers of each of these different types of vertebrae. So cervical vertebrae are going to be the ones in the neck. Thoracic vertebrae have the ribs attached in the thorax, and then lumbar vertebrae, if you've ever heard of the word lumbar support or lumbar pain, maybe, we're referring to like the lower back. And then down like in the pelvic region, we have the sacral like nerves as well as the sacral vertebrae. And then lastly, the coccygeal ones, which is where you find the coccyx of the tailbone. So there's typically in vertebrae 7, 12, and then 5 for cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. But for spinal nerves, there's actually 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, and then 5 lumbar spinal nerves. Now to introduce some terminology, which will be important. Let's just get through these. So first of all, peripheral nerve. So when you hear the word peripheral, what do you think of? Like periphery, outside, or rather extensions. Like peripheral nerves are basically the named nerves, like the nerves that you usually see like going to a body part. So those that travel outward are the peripheral nerves. But then peripheral nerves will also have their segmental innervations, which is basically the roots that we were talking about. So C1 through 8, T1 through 12, L1 through 5, like those would be the segmental innervations, which are from the spinal cord. So these are going to be the ones that are basically where those nerves originate from. And depending on if one of those segmental innervations or segmental portions or roots rather were to be an issue, like that's going to cause issues for every nerve that comes off of it. But then a few more terms, cutaneous nerve, that means nerves that go to the skin. And then in a similar way, dermatome is referring to like nerves of the skin, but specifically the region that a single sensory nerve is going to cover. So a dermatome, like a certain region or certain body part, like maybe the front of your forearm, is innervated by a certain nerve. So that would be its dermatome, the front of the forearm. And then similarly, that nerve might have a myotome, which is the muscles that it goes to. Like sometimes it'll just be one muscle, sometimes it'll be like a bunch, but yeah, the myotome is going to be innervating certain muscles. And then a few just kind of like specific terms as well. PPTT, that refers to pain, pressure, temperature, and touch. Articular branches are referring to like nerves that go to articulations or joints. And then proprioception is going to be like understanding your bodily position. So the main ones that we'll mostly talk about are peripheral, segmental, but later on we will talk about dermatomes and myotomes as well. Now, a little bit more about the spinal cord. Looking at the spinal cord, do you see that there are nerves or roots coming off of both sides of the spinal cord? These are called ventral and dorsal roots, and depending on which side it comes off of, it'll be ventral or anterior, dorsal or posterior. So these are going to be like the roots that come off of the spinal cord, but look closely. Those roots actually join together here. And this is where you have these structures called rami or ramus. And if you look closely, there's a small ramus that's coming off the back. That's called the dorsal ramus. And then the big one that's going outward, that's called the ventral ramus. So dorsal ramus is the one on the back. Ventral ramus is the one that goes out, and those, the ventral rami, are the ones that generally go to the body, or like different parts of the body. Those are the ones that travel very far, but just to be clear, the dorsal rami do travel specifically to like the deep intrinsic back muscles, but also some sensory information regarding the back as well. Okay, so a few more terms, we're almost there. So I think we have one more on the next slide, but motor point. What a motor point is indicating is where a nerve goes into the muscle. And usually that motor point is very central to the muscle. This allows the muscle to spread out throughout the body, or sorry, spread out throughout the muscle to innervate different regions of it. And then the next one that we have here is called motor units. So this one is a little bit specific. So just to be clear, to explain a little bit about nerves, nerves carry signals, but they do that through nervous cells called neurons. And in a nerve, there could be a number of neurons in there. And depending on what muscle fibers each neuron goes to, like that is what's going to form motor units. So you have a bunch of neurons together inside of a nerve. And then if we look at one neuron, that one neuron will then branch out to go to maybe like 5 to 10 fibers. Sometimes it can be a lot, like hundreds of fibers, but let's just say 5 to 10. So when that one motor neuron contract or stimulates or is stimulated, it will actually stimulate all of those muscle fibers. That's what a motor unit is going to be. And it does that by sending its electrochemical signal through neurotransmitters from the neuromuscular junction. Now, lastly, for here at least, we have a difference between what's called lower and upper motor neurons. And basically the difference is like in the brain, you'll find the upper motor neurons. That's where like everything is kind of initiated from for the most part. And then lower motor neurons are going to be the ones that go like down the spinal cord. So upper motor neurons higher in the brain, and then lower motor neurons, the ones that travel down. And then one more major term, which is Hilton's law. Basically, if a nerve travels across a joint and it is innervating that muscle, like that typically means that this joint is going to be innervating the articulation as well, and then also some of the skin in that region too. So it's very generally like if it goes to those muscles and those muscles are doing some action, it usually goes to that joint as well as the different regions of the skin that are close by. Now, to give you a few examples of what we're going to be doing, like this should hopefully look familiar because we've been talking about it along the way, but you have supraspinatus and it's peripheral innervation or like nerve innervation, and that's the suprascapular nerve. But then the segmental innervation is what roots are going to that nerve. And in this case, it's C5. And then for deltoid, axillary nerve is the peripheral innervation, and then segmental, C5 and C6. And then muscle serratus anterior, peripheral innervation through long thoracic nerve, and then segmental innervation, C5, C6, and C7. So what we're going to be looking at are the different regions of the brachial plexus. And for the most part, you can see that it's divided like along the way, but it starts over here at the roots. It then like forms these structures called trunks. Then the trunks will form regions called divisions. And then it's going to cause or going to form things called cords. And then lastly, branches. So a pretty weird group of structures. But there is a mnemonic that we use to remember these, which is real Texans drink cold beer. So real roots, trunks, Texans, drink divisions, cords, cold, and then lastly, beer, branches. So for our roots, we actually have just those roots that are coming out of the spinal cord, which is C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. Those should sound familiar as we've been using those throughout like the majority of the muscles that we've been talking about. So C5 to C8 and then T1 are our roots. Now, something that I'm going to try to do along the way, I don't know how well this is going to work, but we're going to try and like draw these out as we go. So this might take a little bit of time, so hold on. We have some divisions, first of all. And then we have our roots. So we have C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. So as I'm doing this, you might as well get a piece of paper out and do this with me because it can be very helpful to draw it out and organize it yourself. But these are the roots, and that's where you're going to have C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. So far so good. Now let's go ahead and go back really quickly to our PowerPoint. So from the roots, now we're going to get things called trunks. And if you look at this picture, you can see that some of these roots are actually joining together, and then some of them aren't. So in your trunks, you'll have three different trunks, the upper, middle, and lower trunk. You can also call this the upper or the superior, inferior, and then middle trunk as well. So if you look closely at this picture, C5 and C6 are joining together to form the upper trunk. C7 is just continuing on. This is just going straight into middle trunk. And then although you can't see it, C8 and T1 will then join together to form the lower trunk. And before I start drawing again, let's look at our next part, which is called divisions. So divisions is where it gets a little bit weird. So first, we have three trunks. Now, what those three trunks are going to do is all of them are going to branch out to an anterior and posterior branch. So all of them will branch out to an anterior and posterior branch. So when you start out with three trunks, now you're going to end up with 6 divisions. So just to look at this like visually, here's your three trunks, like lower, middle, and upper. Now upper has 1 and 2. Middle has 1 and 2. And then lower has 1 and 2. So let's go back and try and draw this at least a little bit. So let's see where we're at the moment. So we've had C5 and C6. They shoot. They have joined together. C7 has continued on all the way through, actually. And then C8 and T1 have joined together as well. So what this is giving you are your trunks now. So your trunks will include upper, middle, and then lower. Now, each of them are going to divide. And in this case, it's going to be helpful to have like a different color for like the different branches because number one, it's going to be confusing, but number two, there are two branches, an anterior and a posterior branch for each. So looking at the upper branch, first of all, there will be two branches. Oops, I wanted that to be a different color. This is an anterior branch, and then let's see what color. Let's do black. This will be a posterior branch. Now, I'm going to actually kind of like get ahead of myself because there is a little bit of a interesting way in the way that these connect. So upper branch has anterior and posterior. Middle branch is going to have anterior and posterior as well, but the middle branch is going to connect to the upper branch. So, oops. Why? All right, I guess that works. There we go, finally. And then just to be clear, the lower branch has a posterior branch as well, which also comes up here as well. So all three of the posterior branches join together. Now, what I want you to also notice here is that when you have all of these posterior branches joining together, that means that there are nerves that come from potentially all of these roots. So all of these roots are going to go all into these posterior nerves. So if you've ever seen a nerve with like a bunch of different roots, like roots segmental innervations, I mean that's one of the reasons. But let's go ahead and go back to our anterior branches because some of those will connect as well. So the middle and upper anterior branches will connect, and then the lower is going to actually just be by itself. So these are going to be the divisions, which makes sense in its name because you had a lot of dividing. Now the next region that we have here is called the chords, and I might as well write the last one. These are called the branches, but these are peripheral for the most part. So let's go ahead and keep on following these connections. So first of all, you have those anterior chords that are going to be here. They both continue from where the divisions join together. So you have a lateral chord, you have a medial chord, and you remember where those black ones were? Those were actually all posterior. So these are going to be the posterior chord. So you have lateral, medial, and then in the back, all of those posterior divisions form the posterior chord. Now, this is where you start to get to like the peripheral branches. So this is where you have like a bunch of branches. So unfortunately and fortunately, like this is where we actually do start to see like the actual named nerves. So shoot, I just realized I got ahead of myself. So let's go back to the slides real quick and get to there as well. So if you look closely, those like different divisions are going to form these three different chords, which will include the lateral, the medial, and then the posterior chord. So these are going to then branch out to the different named nerves. which are going to be the ones that actually go to the muscles. So once again, though, let's look at those chords and see that like those chords are formed by different roots, specifically the lateral chord. Like that was going to be the anterior and anterior one. So that's going to be with C5, C6, and C7, another anterior and anterior, but this one was actually only from like the lower trunk. So C8 and T1, just two. And then that posterior chord had all three of those, or all three of those posterior divisions, which gives you C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. Basically all of them. So here you can actually see that a little bit better. And then finally, we're going to get to like our actual branches. So we have a bunch of branches, which will be some of these, but also some smaller ones. So I'm actually going to go back to that picture a little bit later and talk about these other ones first. So our first group of nerves that we have here are called the supraclavicular nerves or supraclavicular branches. And this is going to give you a few that will be kind of like going above the clavicles, including dorsal scapular nerve, suprascapular nerve, long thoracic nerve, and then subclavian nerve or nerve to subclavius. Now the dorsal scapular nerve, like this is going to go along the back of the scapula. So this nerve is actually one of the first ones that come off at actually like the root, like at the, or sorry, at the, well, yeah, the root, sorry. So at the anterior ramus, this is going to be where you have it basically coming off of your root C5. So your root C5 is going to have the dorsal scapular nerve. And remember, this is very close to like where all the nerves are coming off. So these are very medial. So you can actually see this nerve over here going to your levator scapulae, as well as your rhomboid major and minor. So this is going to go somewhat medially from the cord, or sorry, from the root C5 to go to your rhomboid major and minor, as well as your levator scapulae. So dorsal scapular nerve. Suprascapular nerve, we have been talking about this quite a bit because of lab, but suprascapular nerve, this has some other structures with the word suprascapular nerve related to it. So, do you remember suprascapular notch, suprascapular ligament? So, suprascapular nerve is going to be up here, and it's going to go under the suprascapular ligament, kind of like along the suprascapular notch, or rather through the suprascapular foramen. I know, a lot of suprascapular, but it's going to go through there, and then it's going to go along the edge of the spinoglenoid notch, and then down to the infraspinatus. So this nerve is going to be innervating those muscles along the way, the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, but then also part of the glenohumeral joint. Now, another nerve that's coming off relatively early, or that's actually very, very early, this is called the long thoracic nerve. So once again, it hasn't traveled far. It has come off of basically the roots. So it has come off of all three of these actually. C5, C6, C7, like there is a portion of it that comes from each of them. But remember, these are off of the roots, which are very close to the spinal cord. So these are going to be coming off pretty medially. So this is actually just going to be right along the thorax, right over a certain muscle, and if you look closely, you might recognize it. It's the serratus anterior. So it goes right along the serratus anterior and innervates the serratus anterior as well. Now our next nerve, a pretty small nerve as well as a very short nerve, the subclavian nerve, or nerve to subclavius. Now, this nerve is also going to come off pretty quickly. It doesn't go very far. So it is going to be coming off of C5. So it's going to be coming off of C5 and C6 because it's coming off of the superior trunk. So remember, the superior trunk is where the C5 and C6 roots meet, and that's where the subclavian nerve is going to come off of it. So because both of those roots meet to form superior trunk, it can receive nerves from both of them. Now, what does subclavian refer to again? Subclavian is under the clavicle. So it goes under the clavicle to the subclavius. And then it also does innervate the joint that it crosses, the sternoclavicular joint. So I know that this has been a lot of nerves, and there's more to come, but try to take it little by little. And then also try to consider, where is it coming off? Where is it going? Because a lot of that will be related to each other. So do your best to do that. But also once, or like we've been doing, I know it's a lot, but try to work on those roots as well. So with that said, let's keep going now. A lot of nerves here, but all of these nerves, or at least a lot of these nerves, will be pretty big nerves, but then you also have some somewhat small ones as well. So let's take these by the different chords. So first, the lateral chord. So the lateral chord is going to actually have a nerve that comes directly off of it before it divides in the branches. This is called the lateral pectoral nerve. And once again, it's not going too far. You don't necessarily need to go all the way to the branches, so it's coming off of the lateral chord. And since it is somewhat down the line, it is going to receive fibers from C5, C6, and C7. And you probably have guessed, lateral pectoral nerve is going to innervate at least some of the pectoral muscles, and specifically the pectoralis major. So you can see the lateral pectoral nerve right here. It is going to go through the costocoracoid membrane. Remember, going from the coracoid process to the ribs. It's going across that membrane up here, and then it's going to go into the pectoralis major, specifically the clavicular portion. Now, finally, moving down to the branches all the way down, after the chords, we have our first major arm nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve. And in fact, in this whole lecture, we talked about this a couple times because the musculocutaneous nerve is innervating the biceps brachii, the brachialis, the coracobrachialis, and where do you think you find it? Going to those muscles. So if you look closely, here's the lateral cord, and this is the musculocutaneous nerve coming off of it. And furthermore, what is it going through? It is going through the coracobrachialis. It's going going under the biceps brachii. It's going over the brachialis, and it's innervating all of those muscles. So try to, or learning the innervations of the muscles will definitely help. And that's going to help you with figuring out where it's going to be going, because it's going to go to those muscles as well. But just to be clear, if you follow the musculocutaneous nerve downward, you will also see that there are branches that come out a little bit superficially. These are called cutaneous nerves. This nerve right here is actually called the lateral cutaneous nerve of the forearm, or the lateral antebrachial cutaneous nerve. So, as its kind of name tells you, it is going to be going to the skin of the lateral forearm. So there will be both motor but also sensory functions to a lot of these different nerves. Now, our next nerve is actually formed by both the lateral and the medial cord. So both the lateral and the medial cord will be formed by, or will form the median nerve. So it's a little bit weird because you'll have both of those cords joined together and form like a V shape. So if you look closely, you have this V shape right here, which forms the median nerve in the middle. Now, something that I should have mentioned regarding musculocutaneous and median nerve is that these are coming off of the anterior parts. So those anterior divisions form the lateral and medial cords, and now you have the anterior like nerves, which include musculocutaneous, median, and ulnar. So the median nerve right here is formed by the two median or anterior cords, the lateral cord that had C6 and C7, and then the medial cord which had C8 and T1. So the median nerve, it innervates a lot, but just to be clear, like it's gonna kind of bypass all this stuff in the arm and mostly go to the stuff in the forearm. So as you can see, it's gonna go to a lot, but I will kind of reserve this a little bit for when we talk about the forearm because it is just way too much to kind of like go over right now. But I would just to kind of like to give you like a general description in that it's going to be innervating the anterior forearm muscles, at least most of them. Like it is going to be innervating the anterior forearm muscles. And really quickly, think about this. Are they going to help with flexion or extension? So did the flexors or extens, or was it flexors or extensors on the anterior arm? So hopefully you are thinking about this, but it's going to be the flexors. The median nerve is going to be innervating the anterior flexors. So these are going to be on the forearm, and most of them are going to be going down to the hand or fingers to help with flexing both the wrist, the hand, or the digits. Now, just to be clear though, the median nerve will have like some different branches, such as the anterior interosseous nerve, as well as nerves that go like into the hand as well. So like the palmar cutaneous branch. So the median nerve is going to innervate quite a lot, but it will also have sensory innervation as well. So if you look closely, the median nerve is going to go down to the hand, and that's where you'll have something called the recurrent branch of the median nerve, which goes like into the palm region, and then also the lateral branch of the median nerve as well, which goes to like it goes to like the hand and fingers basically. So specifically though, it goes to the lateral anterior 3.5 digits. Now, what does that mean? Lateral. So, okay. So when you look at your hand in anatomical position, it's going to be like this. Like at your side, that means that the lateral fingers are 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3, and then half of your ring finger. So lateral 3.5 digits will be thumb, index, ring or middle finger, and half a ring finger. That's the lateral 3.5 digits, but it's specifically going to go to the anterior side, but just a little bit to the fingertips as well. So given that I'm kind of breaking down like the innervations of the hand, that means that other nerves are going to go to the rest of it. So let's keep going. And we have gone from the lateral cord to the median, or sorry, the lateral and medial cord joining to form the median nerve. And then to continue on the medial cord, just like how we had on the lateral cord, we also have a medial pectoral nerve. the medial pectoral nerve is going to be a nerve that's going to go to the pectoral or the pectoralis major or major again, but it will also go to the pectoralis minor. Now, I do want to kind of like remind you, the medial cord basically has its entire formation from the lower trunk, which is formed by C8 and T1. So medial cord, lower trunk, anterior division, like basically the whole thing is coming from C8 and T1. So there's your branches, C8 and T1. And the medial pectoral nerve, you can see right over here, it's going to go through the pectoralis minor into the clavosternal portion of the pectoralis major. Now, also coming off of the medial cord, there's going to be a couple of cutaneous nerves that come all the way off up here, like in the kind of like armpit region. So you're going to have to look kind of closely. I mean, I'm doing the same, but these are really small. Like you can see this small nerve that's coming off of the medial cord. This is called the medial cutaneous nerve of the arm. And that nerve, like specifically, what did I say? Medial cutaneous nerve of the arm. So arm means like the upper portion of your upper extremity from shoulder to elbow. So this is going to help with the sensory innervation in that part of the skin. Now, right next to it, you have what's called the medial cutaneous nerve of the forearm. So medial cutaneous nerve of the forearm, this is going to be also coming off of the medial cord, but what does forearm mean? It goes down all the way to the forearm. So this is going to go down along the arm and then into the skin of the forearm. So a vein that we're going to be learning, like that it'll actually be pretty close to, is called the basilic vein. So we'll get there, but for now, let's keep going to our next nerve, which is the actual major peripheral nerve or branch of the medial cord called the ulnar nerve. So the ulnar nerve is going to have like, well, the ulnar nerve is going to be going along the ulna, but if you know where the ulna is, it's actually along the side of the pinky. So it's going to be going right along the medial side of the arm. It's actually going to go behind the medial epicondyle of the elbow, and then it's going to go to the medial side of the forearm as well as hand. So the ulnar nerve is actually something that I'm sure you've experienced at some point, like not just in general, but in a specific phenomena, which is called the funny bone. So this actually runs right behind the elbow, and when you hit the back of your elbow just right, like that's hitting your ulnar nerve. So your ulnar nerve is going to be right behind your elbow, and it is going to be what gives you that tingling sensation if you hit your elbow on your table or otherwise. And in fact, you can probably even press it and you'll feel something similar, but don't do it too much. But you can feel it behind your elbow over there. So just to like continue though, it is going to go along the forearm and right along the medial side over here. It is going to be innervating some forearm muscles, which, like I said, I'll try to reserve, but just to be clear, there's like one exception in the flexors that like the ulnar nerve really goes to, which is called flexor carpi ulnaris. But just to like also elaborate, it does go to a couple more muscles as well. But then it's going to be going to like the hand, and that's where it's going to have like different branches, and then specifically it is going to be innervating like the medial 1.5 digits. So remember, it goes to the medial 1.5 digits. So that's going to be like your pinky and your ring finger, but not just one side. It's going to go to both anterior and posterior medial 1.5 digits. So you can see pinky and ring finger. It is going to go to anterior and medial side. So there will be two different branches that go to it. So this is a little different, but it goes to the medial 1.5 digits, while so far the median nerve has gone to the anterior lateral 3.5 digits. So that we only have one side and a few digits left. Let's go ahead and keep going to get to that nerve. Now, our next nerve that we have here is called the upper subscapular nerve. So this is our first nerve of our posterior cord. So upper subscapular nerve, I mean, that also means that we have a lower subscapular nerve, but these subscapular nerves are going to both come off of the posterior cord, and then it's going to go along the subscapularis. So this is going to be going along the anterior side of the scapula to go to the subscapularis. And you can see the posterior cord, and you can see a couple of branches here, the upper and lower subscapular nerves. Now the lower subscapular nerve will also have an additional muscle that it goes to, which is the teres major. So I know it's a little bit odd, but remember that they both are actually doing the same actions, or at least one of them, medial rotation or internal rotation of the arm. So these nerves are kind of like divided a little bit functionally, because you might think that's like teres major would be innervated by, I don't know, axillary or suprascapular nerve or something like that, but it is going to be doing or innervated by similar nerve, or a nerve, similar nerve with muscles of the same functions, or at least similar. So just bottom line, subscapularis and teres major innervated by lower subscapular nerve. Now, although it kind of goes out of order, like there's actually also a nerve kind of in between those two. So it shows a little bit better here. If you look closely, this right here and this right here are your two subscapular nerves. So upper and lower. This one in the middle is actually called thoracodorsal. So thoracodorsal nerve, oh, I think this one shows it even best. So upper, lower, and then thoracodorsal nerve. So thoracodorsal nerve is another branch of the posterior cord. Remember, it's coming out from between those two other nerves. And this is what's going to be innervating the latissimus dorsi. So this innervates the latissimus dorsi, and you can see that right over here, like very close to the insertion where you have the teres major. So latissimus dorsi, teres major, like they have similar nerve origins, but lower subscapular nerve for teres major, thoracodorsal nerve, like right behind it, but both of them come off the posterior cord. Now moving to a nerve that we did talk about in lab, so hopefully this one sounds familiar, but axillary nerve. So axillary nerve is one of the main peripheral nerves that comes off of the posterior cord. So this is one of the terminal branches of the posterior cord, and you can see it coming off right back here. And if you look closely, it is going through the quadrangular space around the back of the humerus to go to the shoulder region where it innervates in the deltoid. Now, if it goes around to the back of the humerus, what artery travels around or along with that, posterior circumflex humeral artery. So posterior circumflex humeral artery travels with axillary nerve, and then axillary nerve goes to the shoulder region to innervate the deltoid. But along the way, it does innervate like the teres minor as well. So like both of those muscles will be innervated by the axillary nerve. And then being that it's going to be up here already, it'll also innervate the region of the shoulder, but also the glenohumeral joint. So passing the joint, it innervates a lot of that as well. Now, the radial nerve, this is going to be the other big branch of the posterior cord. And once again, we did talk about the radial nerve as well. And if you remember from lab, where did we find it? We found it along the triceps brachii. So is that anterior or posterior? So that should make sense. Radial nerve comes off of the posterior cord. It goes behind the humerus, innervating the triceps brachii between like the long and lateral head. So the radial nerve along the from the posterior cord goes behind the humerus. So hopefully that kind of like is starting to make a little bit of sense, because where it's coming from is also related to where it's going. And then where it's going is related to the muscles that it's innervating. So the radial nerve goes behind the triceps brachii, innervating both triceps brachii and anconeus. But then it also does go to basically the majority of the extensors. So it's going to go to the extensors of the forearm, which are all on the back of the forearm. And once again, I'll kind of save that to talk about like when we go over the forearm and all of its muscles. But there are going to be branches that come off of it as well. There will be a deep portion that is going to be like going through the posterior forearm to go to all of those extensors. But then there will be a superficial portion that comes out from under a muscle called the brachioradialis. And it's going to go kind of like superficially right over here along the wrist. So as you can see, that whole pathway that is traveling through along the back of the arm and forearm, it's going to go and innervate those different regions. But look at that. We have our last part of the hand, and that is going to be the innervation of the radial nerve. So the lateral posterior, or the posterior lateral 3.5 digits, that's the radial nerve. And then remember the anterior lateral 3.5 digits was median nerve. And then the medial anterior and posterior 1.5 digits was ulnar nerve. Now, if we look at that superficial branch, you can see that it travels kind of like, or it continues to travel into the hand. And you can see it going to like different regions of the thumb, or the back of the thumb, and the back of like the digits 2 and 3 as well. So it's going to do, or it's going to go to like that specific region of the hand, but it's going to innervate a lot of muscles along the way. So you can see that there's quite a few nerves of the upper limb, but if you divide it between like what cords they come from, what muscles they go to, what side of the arm and forearm they're on, like that's like telling you a lot. So there's quite a lot of ways to like look at this, and I'll give you a few examples, but real quick, let's just finish this up. Take a look at this hand, and you can kind of see like the differences in like the differences in the sensor innervation. So radial nerve going to the lateral 3.5 digits. The median nerve going to the anterior lateral 3.5 digits. And then the ulnar nerve going to the medial, anterior and posterior 1.5 digits. Okay, so let's go to our drawing again real quick. I know it's been a while, but let's bring that back and take a look at where we left off. So if you want to, we can go over the smaller branches in class, but I just want to keep it relatively simple for now because otherwise it's going to get crazy. So what do we have here first? We have our roots. So roots C5, C6, C7, C8, C8, and T1. C5 and C6, they join together to form the upper trunk. The C7 just continues as middle trunk. C8 and T1 join together to form lower trunk. Now, each of those three trunks are then going to divide into anterior and posterior divisions. So each of those trunks divide. So the upper and middle anterior branches join together. The anterior lower division just continues actually, but all of the posterior divisions join together right over here. Now, from those divisions, you are then forming these different chords, and you have two anterior chords, the lateral. Here, let's actually write that in because that's actually really helpful. Anterior, anterior. Those are your lateral and medial chords, and then posterior, kind of self-explanatory. This is the posterior chord. So posterior chord, lateral chord, and medial chord. Now, this is where we left off. This is where we now have our different branches. So let's actually do our one posterior chord and its two branches really quickly. So the posterior chord is going to continue, and then it is going to branch to two nerves. So one and two. So remember, you have posterior chord, you have posterior branches. At the very least, what innervates the muscle on the back of the arm? So the back of the arm was the triceps brachii. What nerve innervates that? Radial nerve. And then there's a branch that also comes off of radial nerve. That nerve goes along the back of the humerus, around it to the deltoid. This is axillary nerve. Now, that's good. That's basically the branches of the posterior chord. But now we also have the anterior chords, which will include a couple of weird things. But here, now that we have this, let's take a look at the way that this comes off of these chords. So first of all, coming from the lateral chord, you have one that directly comes off of it. And then you also have one that directly comes off of the medial chord. So those two, the first one is actually going to go laterally to the coracobrachialis. And I know it's been pretty recent, but if you remember, that's the musculocutaneous nerve. And then the anterior chord is on the medial side. Remember what the bone, okay, we didn't learn this yet, but the bone on the medial side of the forearm is called the ulna. So this is the ulnar nerve. Now, when we look at these nerves, there's actually one in the middle and named for middle. At least I like to think of it that way. Going down the middle of the arm and straight to the front of the forearm, we have our last major branch, or terminal branch at least, median nerve. So middle median nerve. So I would like you to try and look at these nerves. And if you haven't, don't just look at my picture. Draw it, draw it out. And then also try to think about where are these nerves coming from? Like sometimes it'll work out. Sometimes it'll be relatively intuitive. But sometimes you just kind of need to like remember which roots lead to which nerves. Because if you look at, I mean, some of them will make sense. Look at ulnar nerve. Like ulnar nerve is going to have basically, if you follow it back, I mean, there are some discrepancies, like maybe one, but for the most part, it is receiving all of its nerves from C8 and T1. But then on the other hand, look at radial nerve. Radial nerve, if you go back, like once you get to here, you can see that radial nerve gets its nerves from up here, C5, C6, here, C7, and then over here, C8 and T1. Like radial nerve can get its nerves from basically everywhere. So depending on what muscle the radial nerve is innervating, like those roots, it could be any combination of these. But ulnar nerve, it's usually going to be like C8 and T1. So try to consider where are these nerves coming from? Try to consider like how these nerves are connected. And then there's even one more way to take a look at like these nerves, which is just like, well, at least for the anterior terminal branches, there's this thing called the M. So, oh man, I kind of ran out of room. So if you need to, go back and take a look at this, but I'm just going to show you the M as well. So I'm going to clear it off, giving you like fair warning. So let's take a look at our anterior chord, or yeah, anterior chords. So you have two chords here. You have the lateral and the medial chord. So lateral and medial chord. Oh, what am I doing? Lateral chord and then medial chord. Now, if you remember, there's going to be one branch that comes off of both of them basically straight out. Those are going to include the musculocutaneous nerve coming off of the lateral chord, as well as the ulnar nerve coming off of the medial chord. And then if you look, and then if we like think back and really try to remember, these two chords actually join together. So from lateral and medial chords, they join together and then they form one chord in the middle. That chord, or sorry, not chord, that branch is called the median nerve. So there's something that you might be able to see here, which, I mean, it's kind of helpful, but this is basically called the M. Do you see how there's like a capital M here? Like this is a great way to look at these peripheral branches. There is an M that connects these three using these chords. And if you can find any of these three, this will help you with finding the rest. Like you want to kind of consider which one is easiest to find for you. Like it could be any of them really, but one that I like to use, and I'll show you in the cadaver lab, but musculocutaneous nerve, it is very clearly going into coracobrachialis. If I can find this, I can then follow it up, connect it, and see that median nerve is right over here. And then do that one more time, is connected on the other side to ulnar nerve. So let's take a look at the picture of these nerves real quick, and then that's about it. That's it. So if you look closely, oops, that's not great looking, but we'll take what we can. So this is the M. And I know it's not like perfect, but it's kind of as good as it gets sometimes. So hold on. How do I draw on this? Okay. Well, I can definitely draw here. So let's see. The M, if you look closely, is lateral chord, medial chord. The M is right here. It's an M. And this is musculocutaneous nerve, medial, or sorry, lateral. Follow it up in the middle where they both connect. Median nerve. Follow it up where they connect. Ulnar nerve. Alrighty. Well, I know that the nerves can be a little bit daunting at first, but please take your time with it. Please look at it carefully and don't wait. Start practicing. If you have questions about it, please let me know, but we will talk about this, at least or we can talk about this next week on Wednesday. So I think with that said, that's about it. So thanks for listening. Good luck with your studying, and I'll see you all soon.